So in the past few months, Emma and I have been seeing a real uptick in the number of media stories in our feeds, on cannabis overdoses resulting in ER visits and related stories on general health risks associated with cannabis use. Some of those stories were definitely like in the bad faith histrionic, cannabis causes psychosis, causes murder vein, those kinds of arguments that Emma and I covered on episode 24 of the show, the title of which was Is Cannabis Safe? But on the flip side, we felt there was a lot of honest reporting that we saw as well. Joining us today to unpack all of this is returning This Is Cannabis champion, Dr. Adie Rae.
Hello.
Academic neuroscientist and science maven at Smart Cannabis. Dr. Adie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Yes.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. How are you?
I'm great.
Good.
Yeah.
Let's get right into it, all right? You have a very straightforward thesis about all of this, which is the problem is potency. First off, can we explain for the layperson, especially someone who is living in a prohibition state, what we mean by potency?
Absolutely. Potency simply means packing the most amount of the active ingredient into the smallest space possible. So if you think of alcohol, you have the most powerful concentration of the active molecule ethanol. You have the most concentrated version of that in spirits, whiskey and vodka. Those are the highest potency alcohol products. The ones that are lower potency, there's more volume, more space, and less of the active ingredient. So you're looking at wine or, sake or, something.
Near beer.
Yeah. So potency really means packing more of the active ingredient into the same amount of space. And so when we think about this with cannabis products, it is really THC that we're talking about. So THC is the primary component that drives the intoxication. Some people refer to that as psychoactivity, but that has kind of a different meaning. Psychoactivity is just anything that affects brain function, and lots of things in cannabis affect brain function. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're specifically talking about THC. How much THC can you get into the smallest space possible?
Right. Okay. So, great. So, the problem is potency. Again, so I want to ask, am I mischaracterizing your thesis by saying that the problem is potency rather than saying the problem with potency is ...
Well, I think that there are actually, there are arguments on both sides of that, because potent products aren't necessarily bad if you're using them in moderation or very sparingly or for a very specific purpose, like you have a cancer protocol and you need to blast as much of the cancer with this very potent product.
Right.
So it's not that the problem is potency, but there is definitely a problem with potency, and in fact there are many problems with it. And even thinking about how we got here, why do we have all these super potent products? And one reason is very obvious, and it's that THC gets you high, and that has always been valuable. Like people like feeling high. They like that altered state of consciousness. There is, it is a rewarding substance. It activates the, brain areas that create, a feeling that's good. So of course, the more of it, the better. That's the thinking. But really, the reason that we have the situation we have right now, which is the vast majority of the cannabis market flooded with potent products, flowers that are greater than 20% THC, all of these concentrates in every form and texture imaginable. One of the things that causes potency is prohibition. So we see this with every illicit drug. Every drug that can be abused, if it's prohibited, prohibition promotes potency, because you're literally smuggling this thing. You're trying to pack as much of this product into the smallest space possible because it's being smuggled. So what we have now is really a legacy of prohibition. All of these practices of potency and potent products have been carried over. Yes, because they feel good and there might be some value of it, but also, is it necessary anymore?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, it always seems to me that And again, we were talking just before we started recording about how sort of different cultures, different markets sort of are looking for different things. It seems to me very much that, especially here, possibly in California, although I don't really have a read on that, that the potency issue that we're talking about, and for what it's worth, like, what do you consider to be sort of the midpoint?
Yeah. I mean, if we looked at it just mathematically, what is the cannabis flower, the raw, and I'll start with flower because that really is the foundation for everything else. So if we look at flower, physiologically, it's not really possible for a flower to crank out any more than 31% THC. And if you have lab results that say otherwise, then you probably have a problem with the lab, not necessarily a super flower.
Right, the margin of error or something.
Exactly. So if we look at, 30% is probably the maximum we could ever pump out of a flower. I'm looking at the mean or median and below that. So, right around 15%. This is what we would see from a typical outdoor flower, a sun-grown flower. So, that's about the midpoint. And so everything, north of the midpoint is, if you have to split it into two categories, it's either low or high. That's probably a little bit too, that's not refined enough. And I think that there are lots of different subdivisions within, THC.
But a general rule of thumb, you had said 20.
Yeah.
And then, but so somewhere between 15 and 20 is sort of like the, okay. So, I mean, people look at 15% weed and people don't ever even really, it seems, get an opportunity to buy 50% weed because retail buyers will not purchase wholesale 15% weed to offer to people, which I think helps to make the point I was going to, which is that, in Oregon, it really seems like the market was set up kind of by heavy users for heavy users.
100%.
Which I think is a problem, which we'll get to. But so let's talk about, I'm interested to have you explain sort of for our listeners, like what an acute overdose on cannabis means. We know cannabis is not fatal, et cetera, but, these stories that are, continuing to crop up in the media, at least that I see, like with pretty regularly now, people, and most of these stories are coming out of Colorado, but, people going to the emergency room, like what are some of the like negative health, risks associated with this problem of like 32% cannabis.
Yeah, or even more so, edibles, which are more potent.
And those are generally the culprits.
Exactly. Yeah, so we can talk about that. We can talk about the difference between high potent flowers, which are the foundation for making edibles and for making concentrates. And these emergency department visits are mostly related to the latter two. So edibles are, for a long time, that's what puts tourists in the ER, and concentrates. That's what's typically putting these 21-year-old-ish males typically who are exhibiting with these like really extreme psychotic kind of symptoms, which is super scary and very real. So what is it about? Let's talk about edibles first. So when THC, Delta-9 THC, gets through the digestive system, the liver converts it into another molecule, 11-hydroxy-THC. 11-hydroxy is about 20-fold more potent or more powerful than the Delta-9 molecule itself. So right there, especially if you have a super active liver who's really good at converting Delta-9 into 11-hydroxy, that's a really easy way to flood your brain with THC to the point where it's overwhelmed.
There's like an exponential effect.
Yeah, essentially.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So it's that is particularly, that leaves tourists and novice consumers particularly vulnerable because they're like, I'm not ready for smoking, so I'll try this brownie. And in fact, the brownie is even more risky than the flower would have been. So when you asked about what is acute overdose, really my definition from a pharmacology standpoint is where you cross the line of the therapeutic window. You're no longer in this nice zone of having the effects you desire, and you've crossed that threshold into having undesirable effects.
Right.
You're paranoid. You feel like you're going to die. You don't understand what's going on. You're holding
on to a horse that's going too fast.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So really it's that line, and that line, you can have those mild feelings like, oh, I'm having a bad time, I want to go home and like lay in my bed, or I'm literally going to die, I'm having a stroke, please take me to the hospital. So there's, sort of several degrees of overdose, none of which are lethal, right? It's not fun to have an overdose, and anyone who's had too much of a homemade brownie back in the day before this all stuff was all regulated can tell you, like, it is not fun. A THC overdose sucks, but it also is not fatal. So that's really the definition of what an overdose is, which, there's no real health danger in an acute overdose, but where we start to see the greater risks are with prolonged exposure to high levels or many doses of THC, which then start to put us into this other category of like the risks of chronic potent products or chronic high THC consumption.
Tell me more about that.
So there are a number of things that happen with chronic exposure to a lot of THC and potentially other cannabinoids, but we typically, we understand the most about THC, right?
Excuse me.
So the first one is hyperemesis, so cannabinoid hyperemesis. So this is a syndrome where people feel episodes of nausea and vomiting, which they then attempt to treat with more cannabis. And this is actually a really easy thing to diagnose if the doctors know to look for it, which many of them don't.
Right.
So cannabis hyperemesis is really easy to diagnose because it responds to heat. So people take a hot shower or they apply topical capsaicin cream and the nausea and the vomiting goes away. If it doesn't go away, then it wasn't caused by cannabis. The only way to treat cannabis hyperemesis over the long term is to abstain from cannabis, period. That's it. And we don't know how long you need to abstain, if this is a lifelong condition that you have gone in and monkeyed with your endocannabinoid system so much that it'll never recover. That's probably unlikely, but we don't have any evidence. We just don't know. So again, this hyperemesis syndrome only really presents in people who are using a lot of cannabis, very potent products over a long period of time.
Does it appear non-cannabis related?
So no, there was some thinking for a while that it wasn't actually the cannabinoids that were doing it, that it was like neem, or it was some other pesticide, or it was some other toxin, or something.
Neem is something that people use in the grow itself to ward off gnats and things.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
So there were some hypotheses that it was like, no, it's all this. These are the toxins that are causing the nausea. But no, we have good evidence now that this is directly mediated by the endocannabinoid system as a result of overstimulating that cannabinoid system.
So it's exclusive to cannabis use. That's interesting.
Correct.
I guess my understanding of hyperemesis was that it was like it's obviously a medical term, but it's like something that people throw around like in an emergency room. It's a medical code for vomiting, right? So I didn't understand that it was a syndrome or like a chronic, condition. That's interesting.
Yeah, so there are lots of reasons that you could have chronic vomiting and cyclic vomiting episodes and chronic nausea. There's lots of reasons for that, morning sickness, for instance. But if your chronic nausea and vomiting isn't treated by heat, then it's not cannabis related.
Okay,
if it's treatable by heat, then it is directly related to your cannabis consumption.
And is it specifically linked to THC, or do they find it with other formulations of CBD and other minor cannabinoids?
I don't think we have enough people who are using those other products to be able to gather any evidence about that. The only people we have who present with cannabis hyperemesis are those that are using a lot of THC. So it's extremely likely that it's, mediated by the CB1 receptor specifically. There are definitely other components of the endocannabinoid system that are involved. The TRPV1 receptors are the ones that are responsive to heat and to capsaicin. So, and those are a part of the sort of large umbrella of the endocannabinoid system. So the short answer is we don't know, but it is very likely that THC plays a huge role in hyperemesis. But hyperemesis is just one thing that can go wrong. We've also got there is good evidence to suggest that there is a link between cannabis and psychosis, a link. What that link is, again, we don't have enough evidence. We know that there are, psychosis or schizophrenia. This is a very complex disorder that probably isn't just one disorder, just like, cancer isn't one disease.
Right.
It's lots of different things that can go wrong that result in a cancer or a tumor, which is probably similar with schizophrenia. We try to put this label on these collection of symptoms, and it's quite messy. But we do know that for those people who already have a genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, if you introduce cannabis to them, especially if you introduce it to them at a very young age when their brain is still growing, that's a bad thing, because it could either or diminish the latency or the time it takes to experience their first psychotic episode. So maybe they were already going to develop psychosis at 23, but if they start using cannabis, they might have that episode at 17. We definitely know that if you consume enough cannabis, especially these super potent products like concentrates and dabbing, that if you get enough into the right brain, you're going to end up with these psychotic symptoms, this detachment from reality and the paranoia and all of the things that if you didn't know that that person had just taken a dab, you would think that they were having a full-blown psychotic episode, a schizophrenic episode. So there is definitely a link. Who are the most vulnerable people? We don't know, other than if you're using very potent products, then you are making yourself vulnerable to these kinds of symptoms. So there's a lot of work there left to be done to unpack, like, what is this relationship, and the stuff with Alex Berenson's most recent book, Tell Your Children.
Right. Again, I'll refer our listeners back to episode 24 of our on the podcast. Go ahead.
So this idea that cannabis causes psychosis, therefore, psychosis causes violent crime. There's a whole lot of logical fallacies in that. Right. However, the reality is there is a link. There is some sort of vulnerability, and it would be totally irresponsible to ignore that and just say, that's just the naysayers.
You may not be able to answer this, but do you know if if we're using, can schizophrenia and psychosis kind of be used interchangeably? If the psychosis is like latent in a person, is it possible for it to never be activated if not for cannabis use? We don't know, right? We
don't really know, but that's a great hypothesis. It really is, because we have, our society is pretty good at, we're sophisticated humans who've sort of figured out how to navigate mental health relatively well. So yeah, it could very well be that someone who had never presented with these symptoms, now this triggers it. But, in a way we would never know, because if it never gets triggered, then...
Right. You can't prove a counterfactual kind of thing. Cannabis use disorder.
Yep. This is really the big one. This is the one that almost every...
This is where the rubber hits the road for me.
Yeah. This is the one where if you use cannabis, this is a vulnerability, period. Just like with alcohol, just like with any other drug that's rewarding, just like sugar, just like gambling, just like shopping.
And it should be noted, like, you study the opioid crisis. So, correct. I mean, very much like...
Yeah. So this ability for any rewarding substance to hijack your brain's reward system and make you prioritize cannabis or some other substance over the other things in your life, this is the risk that everyone puts themselves at. And this risk is the greatest with the most frequent use and the most potent products.
Right.
This is evidenced in the literature.
That was going to be my next question.
Yep. We know that frequent use and high potency are directly related to cannabis use disorder. So, the signs of cannabis use disorder are that, again, you're prioritizing cannabis use over things like your social interactions. So your social life suffers in some way, your family life suffers in some way. Economic decision making, you're losing your job, or you're spending more money on weed than you are on groceries, or you're, not able to keep up with your bills because you're spending so much money on weed. So, those things are in addition to physical withdrawal, which is totally real. It's very similar to nicotine withdrawal, irritation, inability to sleep. So and kicking cigarettes is not easy. Like people struggle to get rid of their.
I've been on nicotine lozenges for 12 years.
Right. So, this is not something to just, again, brush under the rug as like the naysayers.
Right.
This is a real disorder. Withdrawal symptoms are real. Physical dependence upon cannabis to feel normal is real. And so the best way to mitigate that risk is to diminish frequency and diminish potency. Allowing the brain to have a break, regular breaks from cannabis is a very good thing. We've seen with brain imaging studies that even if you give physically dependent cannabis users 48 hours of abstinence and then you put them back in a brain scanner, their brain, the CB1 receptor where THC acts, the CB1 receptor looks totally normal, looks exactly like a person who has never used cannabis. So even just 48 hours of abstinence, you're doing your brain a big favor.
That's so interesting. So, so again, to reiterate, cannabis use disorder, you feel like the more you use it, obviously, but the stronger. And again, sorry, are we using that sort of frame, strong and weak, or like because that seems to me problematic?
Strong and potent are
the higher the potency, the more likely you are to develop cannabis use disorder.
That's right. The risk is the greatest with the highest potency and the highest frequency of use.
Well, this was interesting. A resistance to general anesthesia.
Yes.
In prospective surgery patients.
This is a really new one, actually. And what's funny, so I was giving a talk to a bunch of clinicians, a bunch of anesthesiologists who, anesthesia and pain relief are kind of one and the same, and neuroscience is really the root of both of those things. And so I was giving a talk to all these physicians who administer anesthesia as their day job.
Right.
Who knows what they do at night? But so I had someone approach me after the talk and say, what I've noticed is that for my really heavy cannabis users who are like, proud dabbers, they need twice as much propofol, which is the drug that puts people to sleep. They need twice as much general anesthesia as a normal patient does. And they need almost twice as much fentanyl as well, IV fentanyl. So,
yikes.
So
that's like the old story about the guy on the biker on Angel Dust who like picks up a desk and throws it at the cops in the police station, right? They can't like a stun gun won't put him down kind of thing. Jesus, all right.
So then I got back from the talk, and literally the next day a publication came out in the literature describing the exact same thing. So this is now like, it's not just case reports, it's not anecdotal. There is clinical studies demonstrating that people who use potent products or people who use, on a daily basis, they need twice as much general anesthetic and twice as much, intraoperative and postoperative opioids compared to other patients. So, you might be asking yourself, well, who cares? The reason we care is that these drugs are dangerous.
Yeah, fentanyl stop your. Like Tom Petty died from fentanyl. Prince died from fentanyl. Well, let alone
and
hundreds of thousands of other people in this country every year.
Even just from a liver perspective, when you pump all these drugs into a body, the liver's got to metabolize all that stuff. And if you already have a weak liver, or a weakness in your ability to metabolize drugs, then that's a problem. Like you're introducing a health risk to yourself. So, we're again at the very early stages of even knowing that this exists, much less what to do about it. But what we are discussing, amongst the physicians is maybe it's good for, again, for people to take a tea break, like 48 hours before you're going in to get your ACL repaired, like chill out and then allow your body some time to resensitize so that you're not putting yourself at risk for all these, side effects of, a lot of anesthesia and opioids.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yikes.
Yeah.
I didn't like hearing that. That was not fun. Let's continue talking, actually, please, about dabbing and like vaping, the high temperatures associated with both of those activities, toxins, and I wonder about this, and I've been thinking, knowing we were going to talk about this week, I've been thinking about, I recently, about a month ago, a friend of mine died from brain cancer, and since then, my wife and I have been talking a lot about like EMFs and like AirPods, and just sort of like, it's something that we kind of talk about and think about. My wife's been doing some research on about, those sorts of things. And I don't mean to get too far out there on EMFs, but, what are the unintended, what are the unintended consequences, potential consequences of dabbing, vaping in the same way? I wonder, the potential consequences of something like Bluetooth, especially like AirPods that are shooting, Bluetooth right into your brain, just Wi-Fi in general, we're going to find out about in 20 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, what's, talk to us, about dabbing, vaping, the high temperatures,
Well, I mean, I think fortunately and unfortunately, we're not going to have to wait 20 years here. Like, we already have evidence that shows, if you have a dab rig that is too hot, you will break down those molecules in a way that don't get break down under, typical combustion or vaporizing. So I'm talking about whole flower vaporizing. So at a high enough temperature, you break the molecules in a way that they become toxic. And so we see these things, we see these toxic byproducts at certain temperatures, which are very common temperatures with dab rigs. Now, there is increasing technology which is getting around this and making things safer. There are companies that make little ceramic discs that you put in that only get to a certain temperature. There are, double layered glass, bowls or whatever they call them. I'm not a dabber. I can't tell you what the piece is called. But anyway, there's double layers of glass which insulate, the product itself from those extreme temperatures. There are the electronic rigs that don't require a flame or a butane torch. So there are technologies which are allowing people to more closely, get low temp dabs,
mitigate the carcinogens.
And some of them aren't just carcinogens. Some of them are like straight up toxins. They're just straight up hepatotoxicity. They will just cause your organs to fail.
Sweet.
Because a carcinogen is a cancer-inducing toxin, but it's not just a cancer risk. They're just straight up like cellular damaging toxins in high temperature dabbing. So that's dabbing. And then with the vaporizer cartridges, and I think that consumers are finally coming around to this, that, the carrier oils, again, at higher temperatures can be metabolized or vaporized into things that are toxic. So, for a long time, people were using propylene glycol as a thinning agent in all these vaporizer cartridges, which at a certain temperature turns directly into formaldehyde. So,
and that's bad.
A little. So we're, the industry is getting a lot better at not having those things. So the highest quality vaporizer cartridges, you'll see it's just pure cannabinoids. It's pure cannabis oil. And if it's diluted with like hemp seed oil or something. So we're getting better about that, but it's really difficult from a consumer perspective to know, what questions do I ask? Is this a ceramic core in this, heater? And what is what is the thinning agent used? Those are really sophisticated consumers that have to know to ask for those things, or a very responsible retailer who will only carry those kinds of products, which means that they have to know about it and they have to care about it, which a lot of people do, but some don't. So a lot of, profit is still a motive in many of these
I wouldn't imagine that. Sorry, I'm a little more jaded or cynical about that. I don't think that's going to, sorry. Yeah.
Well, it's even consumers who begin to educate themselves around, like, for example, terpenes, where they think, terpenes are good. I need to look beyond THC and cannabinoids for terpenes. But terpenes, especially when added into dabs or other concentrates, can turn into these toxic compounds when heated at the temperature, at a specific temperature. I mean, that research came out of Portland State University, where they were looking at terpenes, synthetic and food grade, that are commonly added to these cannabis oils that turn into benzene when heated at a certain temperature. Benzene, toxin, carcinogen?
I don't know, actually. I don't know what it is.
But very toxic. You don't want to consume benzene. And so again, you need to be very sophisticated in what you know to look for terpenes in whole flower terpene profiles, but that you don't want re-added synthetic food grade terpenes in your concentrates. And so it's a tricky thing for people to understand, and most retailers and bud tenders don't even understand.
And certainly the regulators don't.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Right.
for sure, for sure. And actually, now I what I could say probably about if we're going to look 5 or 10 years in the future, we might actually see some regulated markets banning these kinds of products. Okay,
Right.
like now we know propylene glycol. Nope, that's not allowed. Okay, now we know that like you can't reintroduce food grade terpenes because we can't control how a consumer is going to consume it. So
when
therefore,
it combusts. Right.
exactly.
Sorry.
So therefore, we can't put wax on the shelf at all because we can't put our people at risk of, putting a toxin into their body. If the regulators can't be certain that they're keeping the public safe, then, they might very well decide to pull those products.
Yeah, I think that I think that might happen.
Mm-hmm.
The same way, I mean, you're seeing a lot of activity around just like traditional, like juuling, vaping, juul. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Like whatever the
Yes.
hell it is.
Yeah.
Sound like such an old man, but just kind of. It seems like people are taking a deeper dive into what this stuff actually is.
Yes.
And is it because it's not safe, right?
Yes.
It may not be as dangerous as cigarettes, right? But
Right.
But when you have like cucumber flavor that you're then
Right.
vaping, which vaping implies that it's at a lower temperature, which when we compare it relatively to dabbing, sure, maybe, but it's still a high enough temperature where it is causing a change in conformation of these molecules that otherwise through oral ingestion would be fine.
Bingo. And that's a big difference is like we have these quote unquote food grade molecules that the FDA says, yes, this is generally safe. But historically, those have only been orally administered. They're only in food. And we know their safety from the food literature. But when we take those same compounds, apply heat to them, they may or may not be the same compounds by the time they reach the lung epithelium. And then what are they actually doing to that lung epithelium? So this is a whole other kind of conversation. And, if we look at the literature, just really 30,000 foot view, cannabis smokers don't have more cancer than, nicotine or cigarette smokers. In fact, they might have a little bit less. They don't have more rates of COPD or other inflammatory lung conditions. In fact, they might have less. So we do know that, inhaling burning plant matter is carcinogenic, but we don't know a lot about when you put those molecules directly onto the lung epithelium, what the hell is it doing? Absolutely no idea. No clue. And we're a long way from knowing. Luckily, because of the whole e-cigarette movement, that was slightly ahead, maybe 5 or 10 years ahead of, cannabis legalization. So we have a little bit of data about, what e-cigarette technology does from a health perspective, even in preclinical literature. But so we can glean some of that knowledge and use it
Make
to apply to
assumptions.
this. But honestly, there's a reason that smoking continues to be a very popular method of ingesting cannabis, and from just from a common sense perspective, if you think about what is the moderate and sort of less risky way to do this, and we know that smoke isn't great for you. If I had to say what's the safest way to consume cannabis, it would be whole plant vaporization at relatively low temperatures.
Can you define what that is just for,
So vaping, quote unquote vaping, is typically thought of as the battery with the oil cartridge attached to it. But that's not the only way to vaporize or volatilize these molecules. Another way to do it is to take the flower itself, apply heat to it, not in a way that will make it catch on fire like with a butane lighter, but apply heat to it in a little oven that allows those molecules to detach from the cellulose of the plant. And once it's in that gaseous form, it can be inhaled by the person, just like you would on, a one-hitter or a bong or whatever. And so that is a low temperature situation. So you're getting around all this benzene stuff, getting around all the propylene glycol.
The unintended consequences of combustion.
No combustion. So you're still getting all the good stuff. You are not contributing to, there's all the recyclable stuff too, the packaging for vape cartridges and
sure.
all that. That's a whole other thing. But, you have an economic way to get all the stuff you need without the stuff you don't. So if you were, if you were going to inhale cannabis, that would probably be the most safe way you could possibly do it.
Purist, is that?
I don't know. That kind of has like a judgment kind of connotation. I'm a purist, but
Sure.
it certainly appears to be the safest.
Got it. All right. Lots more to talk about. We are going to take a break. You are listening to This is Cannabis. Our guest is Dr. Adie Rae of Smart Cannabis, and we'll be right back.